Ladies and gentlemen, it is 3:30 and we are ready to start today's Directors Roundtable. This is going to be a shortened version, as most of you have learned if you've gotten the mailers for the work session and the council meeting. The work session starts at 4 o'clock today. We are into budget season. So this will be a shortened version of the Directors Roundtable, and we have a special program for you. And Wayne, are you leading it today?
I think I am.
Okay.
We had the Planning Commission and a few city council people went on a field trip to Walton County to look at a couple of developments and just kind of look at some of the best practices and some of the do's and don'ts. And so we did that, I believe it was the 13th of September on a Thursday. Left at 7 o'clock in the morning, came back about 7 o'clock that night, just a day trip over and back. But we visited Seaside and also Alice Beach and Rosemary Beach. And as most of you know, I worked over there for a number of years before I came to Fairhope, and one of the things that before they left, we drafted a little document kind of giving a little history behind some of these developments and how they were developed and so forth, and so trying to give them some information before they go over there. And one of the things I think is very important to understand is, first of all, these developments have been very successful, but also the county, up until the 80s, really didn't have a big planning function, and Walton County did not. In 1985, the state legislature in Florida created the Growth Management Act, which required counties to have comprehensive plans and those kind of things. And so this kind of coincided with another event where most of South Walton County was somewhat undeveloped, and it belonged to St. Joe Paper Company and some other large landholders, and the state was going to buy it for a state forest. And so that created some controversy because that's a lot of tax revenue that the county would not get, and also very little development potential when that happens. And so, through some controversy, ultimately the state legislature allocated about $1 million to develop what is now called the South Walton Conservation and Development Trust Plan. And this kind of merged a land acquisition plan for state forest along with development plan or a land use plan that was going to comply with the Growth Management Act. The state had certain criteria every county, 6-7 counties in the state of Florida, had to follow in order to get their plan approved by the state. And so that kind of coincided together, and the result was a plan. It had several different elements. They had charrettes, and through a number of very prominent architects, designers, urbanists, and so forth, they created what was called the South Walton Conservation and Development and Trust Plan. And it had elements that met, again, the state requirements. But also what was kind of interesting is that they came up with this village concept. It's kind of a seaside village concept for South Walton, which is everything south of Chattahoochee Bay. And it's kind of interesting because we have a village concept here also, which is interesting, there are some parallels between Fairhope and South Walton with this village concept. So on the map you can see on the screen here, you see these little villages and all, and so ultimately that kind of what sort of brought some of these developments to the forefront. And again, the trust plan was very detailed with styles of development and so forth, walkability, new urbanist communities, those kind of things. And it was a deviation from the typical planning that you see in most of America and a large part of Alabama, which is what's called a Euclidean style zoning, where you have the separation of uses. Now, the term Euclidean comes from a Supreme Court case that occurred in 1926, where the U.S. Supreme Court sort of validated zoning as a legitimate exercise of police power. And that was Amber versus Euclid Realty. That's where the term Euclidean zoning comes from. And Euclidean zoning has caused uses to be separated and to be segregated. You got residential here and commercial here. The only way you can get to those two usually is through driving and so forth. This plan really was more predicated upon a mixed-use concept, this village mixed-use concept, where walking and walkability was important. And so you see that with that plan in place, kind of created a backdrop for some of the developments that we see now over in South Walton. And even today, these developments are done quite differently. It's more of a it's not your typical zoning code you see. Rosemary Beach, for example, is a planned unit development, and the left is their development plan. The right is their regulating plan. This is sort of the zoning code that they use. And as you can see on the right, each one is broken down into different areas. And so that area corresponds to a regulating plan. And you can see that it has the building types, the street types, and so forth. And it's not the typical zoning you see. So we wanted to show the Planning Commission and the council members that this is sort of a different way than what we've experienced in Fairhope, and something we want to try to encourage more, to where it's more of a mixed use, more walkability, and you're really concerned about, not necessarily about the uses, but how the uses integrate together and create walkable communities and things that are close by, rather than having kind of a sprawling kind of development. And you know, some of these, when we talk about walkability and having the appropriate density, it only works when you have the density to support these facilities within a quarter-mile radius or a walkability radius. So this is Rosemary Beach. We went there and visited. We walked through some of these areas with a mixed use. But as you can see, you've got parks, you've got beachfront property. All the uses are fairly dense. You have mixed use around the square, which is sort of the center part there. You can see in the screen. And it was interesting to see the mixed-use concepts and how they worked, and sort of the synergy that creates with the restaurants and the retail. And it's not unusual, but this is not the typical way you see development and that it's occurring in Alabama and even in Baldwin County. As you can see, this is one of the greens that face the Gulf. This is one of the hotels there. This is one of the streetscapes you see looking down toward the beach. So not just Rosemary Beach, but also Seaside, and these are all unincorporated communities, by the way. Everything in South Walton is unincorporated. There's no cities. These are all kind of self-contained developments. Seaside, which occurred earlier, about 1986, Rosemary was developed in 1995, so even before Rosemary, you had Seaside had a very, very similar code, but a very more simple code. Seaside's code is very, very simple. Same type things. You have these street types and these use types that correspond to development. As you can see, the type 4, they called it, in the left-hand side of the screen, is an area that's more geared towards larger homes, a little bit of setback, more of a palatial home, and that's what you have on the left there. Area to the right is some of the mixed-use developments that are around the central square there. And as you can see, you've got retail on the bottom, and you've got condos above it, and a lot of bikes and bike racks and all those kind of things. And this is the extent of Seaside zoning code for the most part. It's basically one page. So it's very, very simple, but has been very, very effective, because this is what you have now, and Seaside's renowned from, you know, all around the country for its design and its feel and its walkability. Just some more. One of the things we also wanted to show the group was, you know, outdoor seating. That's very important. Again, outdoor seating, shading, those kind of things to make a much more vibrant streetscape. When you have activity on the street, when you have seating on the street, it also aids the walkability, and it's just the feel of the street. It feels much more comfortable to walk in, and you're more inviting. So they do this there with a number of outdoor seating opportunities. Again, it was hot this day. It was probably 100 degrees. In some of these areas in the shade, especially the ones that had the natural shade with the trees and all, were quite comfortable and quite cool, even on a hot day. Just some more looks at some of the other things. We were also looking at signage when we went. We're looking at signage, looking at some of the parking standards and some things like that, just trying to get some ideas. Just some of the pavement types and street crossings. These are some of the uses that are on the beach. Again, having places for people to congregate and with views and so forth. We also stopped at Alice Beach and looked at a park. This is a pretty interesting park. It's a small park. The grass is actually astroturf with a lot of hills, kind of padded, so if you fell, you know, you'd be protected, but kind of almost like a low-cost upkeep park, which there's hills and slides and interesting things for kids to play on, and some seating areas and those kind of things. And again, because it's turf and has some of the ornamental bushes and so forth, a little bit lower maintenance than what you typically see and just something to kind of spark the imagination and the creativity, some things we might want to see here in Fairhope. Again, this is more pictures of Seaside and around the square. Again, these were mostly commercial areas. It was concentrated around the square with mixed use and some other interesting features, interesting outdoor art, public art, and things like that. Again, this is at the park again. Just some interesting things to for kids to play on, and that was somewhat unique. And so one of the things that we wanted to impress upon the group was that to have these developments that have been successful and are walkable and by all accounts are very nice. They're not without problems, because we did talk to these developments about some of the problems they've had, and parking is a problem for them, and so we had a discussion about parking and those kind of things and how to handle pedestrian activity. And so we wanted to hear the good and the bad, and so obviously, all these successful developments have issues with parking and with pedestrian access to different places. And it's good for us to hear, because we have the similar concerns here. We have, problems with parking and so forth. However, I think that a parking problem is probably better than not having a parking problem. If you don't have a parking problem, it means you have no activity downtown, your downtown's not thriving. And so
Seems to me the mayor of Manette once mentioned that he wished he had our parking problem.
yeah, I mean, so yes, I mean, we do have our parking problems, but I think the alternative is not better than having a parking problem. And so I think a lot of ours are, and we're studying the parking problem now. As most people know, we have undertaken a study ourselves, trying to figure out what the right allocation of parking is, and also having more signage, so the parking problem it may be a perception problem, because we do have parking spaces that are open at certain times. That's one of the things we'll be looking at with our study. But so they weren't free from problems, but it was nice to hear how they're dealing with those. But one of the things that we wanted to impress upon the group is the importance of planning. Long-range planning is very, very important. It's more important than actually the day-to-day planning. Long-range planning helps you put things in a method of review to where it's difficult for a city or a county, because our planning is done sort of piecemeal when people come forward with development. If I own 100 or 200 acres, I can do it all myself at one time, and I can program it, and it's it's a little easier. What the city's problem is when you get long-range planning is these things happen without our initiation, and so it's our job to make sure that they all fit, and we have to look long-range. So this may not happen in 5 or 10 years, but eventually all these pieces fit together to the city's long-range plan, and will kind of effectuate a change that we want to see in our community. This is an interesting development, and this is just sort of indicate the importance of having good planning and good regulation. This is a plat called Villa Tasso. It's not too far from Seaside at all. Same county, very, very near Seaside. Villa Tasso looks similar to Seaside. You see some of the same characteristics. You see different size lots. You see a variety of housing types, a variety of lot styles, and you see the central square there, and you've got a park and those kind of things. And so by all accounts, it's very, very similar to Seaside. But when you look at and so this is Seaside, and you see it's very similar kind of style, how it's arranged with the streets in the linear fashion. But if you look at Villa Tasso, this is Villa Tasso here. It's sort of a mixture of single-family homes, manufactured homes, just a sort of a hodgepodge, because they had a great layout, but didn't have the regulations necessary to implement that. And so this could have been a Seaside, but without the proper planning and the attention to it from a very early stage on, it wasn't as successful as Seaside. This is Seaside, this is Villa Tasso. I will tell you that I think that the long-range planning and the regulating plan that was put in place by Seaside is what made it what it is. Again, Villa Tasso, it's on the water, it's on the water, it's on the bay there, very, very similar. But because they didn't have the long-range planning that was necessary to really implement that development, it wasn't successful. So I just wanted to show them that, to emphasize that without long-range planning, without having the proper planning in place, you really can't realize the potential of your community. You cannot realize the long-range plans you have, and it's something that takes attention on a daily basis. You can't do a long-range plan, put it on the shelf, and never look at it again. It's not gonna plan itself. It takes attention. It takes every development being reviewed against that plan to make that plan effective and make it relevant. If you don't look at it, it doesn't become relevant. And so I think again, we wanted to impress upon them the importance of the long-range planning aspect and sticking to a plan and following a plan. But I thought the trip was very beneficial. We had some people who wanted to go. We could not take because we didn't have the means to take them because we were full. The bus was full. And so, at some point in time, we may go again. I do think it's good to get out and go look at other communities around our region. It's nice to get out and see other things, other ideas, and so forth. And so this may be an annual thing we do if we can, where we go out and look at other communities. We've got other places nearby that would be great to see as well and learn from them, learn from their successes and even some of their failures, so we don't repeat those. So I thought it was a very successful trip, and it was interesting. I worked there, so I kind of know about it, but it's nice to hear, to show other people some of these aspects of how things could be done better in some cases, and also how to avoid some of the problems they've encountered.
I will tell you, earlier this year, I had the opportunity to go down, spend a night, so I had 2 days down there along the 30A. And I was looking at them because I knew you had come from there, and I'd heard a lot of talk about 30A. And the only thing I would say is in these pictures, it looks more crowded than it really is. The drawings tend to make it look really crammed together, but they are much smaller communities than ours. But really, you are struck immediately by how well planned and how cohesive and
Right.
how easy everything is to get around.
Well, part of the walkability is having these uses close together. When you have to walk, for 200 or 300 feet when there's nothing there, that's dead space. That doesn't lend itself to walkability. A lot of folks think walkability is, hey, we build sidewalks, we're walkable. That's not necessarily the case. Walkability also includes the actual construction of sidewalks, but also the uses that are together there, the interest on the street, those kind of things. Because without that, it's not walkable. When you're walking down a big blank wall, there's nothing to see. It's a very boring walk, and sometimes if it's later in the evening, you may not even feel safe walking down it.
It's a much longer walk.
Right. So the walkability also considers, is there something interesting to draw me along, something to look at other people, those kind of things. And so I think all that plays into walkability. I think it's a bit of a misnomer that if you build sidewalks, you're a walkable community, and that's not the case at all. You have to have those uses in close proximity. You have to have things interesting to look at. You got to have it to where you maybe have street trees to make it a little cooler when you walk in the daytime where it's shaded, or you might have benches to take a break if you're not able to walk as far as some others, and those kind of things. And so
Right.
I think there's a lot about walkability that people may not understand. Again, building sidewalks does not make your community walkable. It's a land use approach, it's a use approach, it's a mixture of uses approach, all those things, again, lead into a walkable community.
Yeah. I would highly recommend anybody who wants to take a day trip, and with an eye of enjoying themselves, some good restaurants along the way too, but also just to get that feeling and understanding of what planning is all about. That's an easy one to do.
Yeah, and I think planning as many times is misunderstood. I know Richard Johnson at the county, we work there, and a lot of times it's not, people don't understand what you're doing, they don't understand the long-range goal, but you have to have that fortitude to stick with it. And if you don't stick with it, you're not going to realize those goals. And I think if you look at the success or failure of communities and larger geographic areas, the ones that are well planned are typically more desirable. Your values are more sustainable and more, more economic return on your investment you make as a citizen in your property. And so I think if you look at some of these areas that are well planned, compare those that aren't well planned, I think it's fairly obvious that there's a big difference in the values you have and the population you have there.
Absolutely.
One of the things about Walton County and in Fairhope and in Baldwin County is that there are very desirable places. And when places are very desirable, you have a lot of people there. And when you have a lot of people there, you do have problems. I mean, you have the parking, you have the pedestrian access issues and those kind of things. So, you do have it's a two-edged sword, but, I think by, again, being very attentive to the planning and to the issues that come along with that, streets and roads and those kind of things, utilities, I think if you stay ahead of it, you can really create a beautiful, vibrant, sustaining city, where your utilities are keeping up with growth, you're keeping up with growth from the standpoint of recreational opportunities for your citizens and streets and those kind of things. So and one thing about planning that I've always appreciated, and even with people at this table today, is that planning is really a comprehensive approach that involves different departments. I mean, I work very closely with Richard Johnson, Richard Peterson, Tom. Planning incorporates all of those. It's multidisciplinary, which I find it very interesting, and so it takes everybody playing their part in that planning role. It's just not the planning department. We're just kind of facilitators, but it takes the people with the different expertise in public works and utilities and recreation and those kind of things and finance and all those to really make it work the way it's supposed to work. And so I've always appreciated that, and then here I've appreciated working with these guys, and I think that that's really played a very important factor in how we do things now.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. We have maybe 5 minutes. If anybody else has any other issues they want to bring out?
Just something kind of one of those good news things and kind of hot off the press. As you know, last fall we had Hurricane Nate, and whenever there are disasters, we'll automatically send a letter to the director of the Alabama Soil and Water Conservation asking if it is a qualifying event that we have some projects that could benefit through what's called the NRCS Emergency Watershed Protection Fund. And this is for streams, gullies, any type of water conveyance systems that are failing or damaged or whatever. And that did at least prompt a visit by the Baldwin County Coordinator, and we visited several sites. Well, immediately following Tropical Storm Gordon, I resubmitted another letter. And this is one of those bad news for our folks on the East Coast, but Florence actually has triggered funding for the emergency watershed protection. So we got to take the director of the Conservation Service of Alabama, as well as the district engineer and our coordinator, to visit those sites again this morning. And they felt very strongly that, one, money was going to be on the way, and several of the sites they really liked for emergency watershed protection. That is a 75%, 25% grant. And the nice thing about it, they pay for the upfront engineering too as part of that grant. So it's split right down that ratio.
Great.
And one of them was the unnamed tributary of Cowpen Creek that flows between hole number 2 and number 3 at Quail Creek.
Yes.
For a stream bank restoration and protection there between Quail Creek Drive and the Golf Cart Path. We also looked at degradation on Big Mouth Gully there at Fairwood, as well as on the opposite side on Equality. So they like those two. And we did visit one on Stacks Gully that at least is on the watch list, and we went down to Oak and Church and looked at the outfall, and it rained real hard before we got there, so we got to kind of see it in action, and that one is there. So I think we're going to, the district engineer was doing what they call the DSRs, which is a damage survey report, and they felt like that there were several project sites they were going to qualify for funding.
Fabulous.
So
fabulous.
Good
All right.
news there. Get
Great.
some improvement in our watershed and our drainage, and at 25 cents on the dollar. Not
Love
bad.
it. I love it. Okay. Very quickly. Anything else? We got 2 minutes. Tom, anything in particular?
Just the swimming pool building's coming along. The contractor that we got has been spot on. He told us when we met with him the other day he'd be out of there by Friday, completely done. Richard's been out inspecting the work and looking at the details, and things are coming right along. Very
Great.
excited about that. It's been a
Super.
long time coming.
Super. Okay, doke. Wayne, thank you for your report. It's
Thank you.
fascinating. I want to go on the next trip. Folks, please stay tuned. The work session will begin at 4 o'clock. Thank you very much.